And so here we are. Chapter 19, Worthless, and the finale. So this is the very final part of the book. They were sitting around a large kitchen table. At last, Pip and Beth were actually inside the old house. The table was old, with deep wood grains running down its length, surrounded by old wooden chairs. The fire crackled in the agar cooker in the corner, even on a warm day like today. The back door was wide open to let in the golden sunshine, and they could see through into the kitchen garden. From where she was sitting, Beth could almost make out the outline of the straight gate. They were all there. Nana and Gramps were sitting opposite to Greg and Catherine, who was just pouring out the tea. At the end of the table sat Mac, and it was he who began the conversation. "So, let's be having a proper look at your treasure," he began. "It isn't real treasure," said Pip, the disappointment obvious in his voice. The excitement of the arrest had buoyed him up somewhat yesterday, but now the frustration he had felt as he unwrapped the so-called treasure with Mac in the den came out at last. "There's no gold. It's just another silly old book. It isn't worth anything," he said glumly, looking at the bundle that they had wrapped up again. It was lying between him and Beth on the bench. "Oh dear," said Nana, sensing his hurt. "But you did ever so well to find it, both of you," she said, looking over at Beth. "You certainly did," said Gramps. "I'd have given up ages ago if it had been up to me. So let's have a good look at this old book then." The grandparents had had a look at the book yesterday, but they had decided to give Greg and Catherine the chance to see it today, since it had been found on their land. Beth brought the parcel up and laid it on the table, unwrapping its leather covering to reveal a very old, hard-backed book, which had been carefully folded into a cloth and then rolled in a strip of leather about a metre long. This time, as Beth unfolded the cloth, her fingers found the embroidery in the corner straight away. It was the letter E, almost the same design as the one inside the diary. As the handkerchief, for so it was, slid back to reveal the book, everyone moved forward to see properly. Beth passed it round to Gramps, who ran his fingers over the front. It was deeply engraved in a rich pattern. Gently he opened it. The leather creaked. "English Psalter," he read. Catherine reached out to touch it, just as a huge bell in the corner of the kitchen began to ring. Greg leapt to his feet. "I'll get that," he said, moving swiftly towards the entrance hall. "Who could this be?" asked Mac, turning in his chair, which had its back to the front door. "Oh, I think I know," answered Catherine. "I hope you two don't mind, but as soon as your Gramps told us last night about your find, Greg thought perhaps we would need an expert along to inspect it." At that moment, Greg ushered their visitors in. They were none other than Hannah, their friend from the churchyard, and another unfamiliar man with a goatee beard, short cropped hair, and glasses. He introduced himself as Professor Jackson from the Burnham Folk Museum. Hannah was the first to speak. "Well, hello again, you two," she began. "When Greg contacted my husband here," she indicated the professor, "I wanted to come along myself to look at this rare find, but I never expected to see my friends from the other day. Are you the two children who found it? I should have guessed," she said, as they nodded. "And here it is," said the professor, walking straight to the table. He looked over to the children, smiled and asked, "May I?" Pip was beginning to feel a little more excited about the treasure, now that so many important people seemed to be here, taking it very seriously. "Sure," he said. The Professor carefully picked up the book. "Well now," he said, examining the cover, "what have we got here?" He pondered, turning the pages with great care, a look of intense concentration on his face. "It's an English psalter," said Gramps. "It is," said the Professor, "but it's not just any old English psalter. It's a Sternhold psalter, one of only a very few that Thomas Sternhold made in 1548. He looked over at the children. "How much do you know about English Bibles at this time?" he asked. "Well," began Beth, "Elizabeth's diary said that there were not many around in 1555, that's 7 years after that, and she was afraid that she would get into trouble for reading the one in church." "I can tell that there's a real story here," began the Professor, "so let me just tell you what you have here, and then you can tell us all about how you came to find it. I know we are all very much more interested in that rather than listening to an old man chattering on about his favourite subject. So, during the reign of Edward VI, Thomas Sternhold was commissioned to translate a number of the Psalms from Latin into English by the young king himself. At this, he opened the Psalter to the flyleaf and read the dedication in the beginning. It says that he dedicates it to Edward VI, certain Psalms chosen out of the Psalter of David. Sternhold was a great scholar, and this is one of the only remaining copies of his first collection of 19 Psalms from 1548. He died just a year later, having translated 37 Psalms altogether. Now, what I'm wanting to hear is, how do you come to have it?" All eyes turned on the children, and for the next half hour or so Pip and Beth told all about their find. They had brought the diary and Elizabeth's letter to show. Somehow they managed to get all the details in, taking over from one another, describing everything, from finding the diary to working out the clues and right down to digging up the Psalter yesterday morning. When they came to the end of their story, everyone exclaimed about how incredible it all was. "But I really thought it was going to be treasure that we found," remarked Pip at last. "But, young man," interrupted Professor Jackson, "didn't you hear what I said? This book is almost unique. It is a real treasure, and to know that it's part of our own local history is amazing." "I think," said Matt, "I think that Pip meant that he was hoping that they might find something valuable," he said, coming to Pip's rescue. "It certainly is valuable," answered the Professor. "It's priceless. And it's not just historically. I imagine that if it were to go to auction, it would sell for thousands of pounds." Everyone looked shocked. "Thousands?" asked Pip, his eyes wide in amazement. "Oh, tens of thousands easily," said Hannah. "So it really is treasure," said Beth. "How fabulous!" "Indeed, how fabulous!" said Mac. "Well done to both of you." "But what were you saying about it being part of our local history?" asked Nana. "Well, we know something of the history of this house, and the record shows that one Elizabeth Crickley did indeed emigrate during the reign of Mary Tudor. It seems now that she left to avoid persecution." All this time Hannah had been sitting very quietly, taking it all in. Now she felt it was time to share her thoughts. "And did you notice, dear," she began, looking over at her husband, with a real gleam in her eye, "when Beth showed us the note, did you notice who Elizabeth is writing to?" Who she's writing to?" repeated the Professor. He paused for a moment. "The gardener?" he said. Pip looked over at Hannah. At their first meeting she had been the gardener. She'd been the gardener, and he smiled at the memory. Hannah was smiling too, but for a very different reason. It wasn't often that she spotted something that her husband had missed, but she was sure that this time she had. "Yes, dear," she said, enjoying every minute of it. "Hunter, the gardener." "Hunter?" queried the Professor. He frowned, and then suddenly he worked out that what Hannah was trying to get at. "You don't think," he began. "I most certainly do," exclaimed Hannah. "Are you sure about the name?" the Professor asked, suddenly looking over at Beth. "The gardener's name was Robert Hunter. It's mentioned in the diary as well as the letter," Beth answered. Turning back to his wife, the Professor asked, "And you think that this might be the brother of William Hunter, the Essex martyr?" Hannah was thrilled with the Professor's reaction. "Well, I do think that it's highly unlikely that there would be two Robert Hunters in this area, both with precious copies of the English Psalter. Don't you?" Hannah said emphatically. "But when you put it like that, I have to agree," he said, looking round at the puzzled faces. He began to explain. "Hannah has made it a particular study of hers to research the history of the Essex martyrs who were put to death for their faith during the reign of Mary Tudor. There were several hundred executed throughout the country, but there were more in this area than anywhere else. There was a very famous martyr, one William Hunter. But I will let Hannah tell you his story." He smiled at his wife, knowing that she always enjoyed sharing her research, and especially now that there seemed to be a real local connection. Hannah looked around at the expectant faces and settled back in her chair to share one of her favourite stories. The best-known book about those who were executed for their beliefs is Fox's Book of Martyrs. In it, he tells the story of William Hunter. William was a young man, 19 years old, who came from Burntwood. Scholars agree that that's the old-fashioned spelling of Brentwood in Essex, just down the road. Although he was only a young man, William would not renounce his Protestant faith, even though to do that would save his life. Eyewitness testimony describes how, just before they light the fire to burn him at the stake, he hands his beloved Psalter to his younger brother. She paused for effect. Robert Hunter. "Robert?" asked Pip. "Robert, who worked here in the house, who lent his book, this book, to Elizabeth?" "So this Psalter is the actual one that William gave him?" asked Beth in amazement. "Well, that certainly seems to be the most likely answer," said the Professor. They all took a moment or two to let this information sink in. "That's amazing," said Catherine. "To think that this is all part of the history of our house," said Greg. "I suppose it kind of belongs here, doesn't it?" asked Pip. "Well," said Mac, "at the moment it kind of belongs to you two," said Mac. "So I suppose we need to know what you would like to happen to it." Pip looked with astonishment at Mac, and then gazed over at Beth. She was smiling, a huge great grin all over her face. "Wow," she said, "you mean We get to choose. Tens of thousands of pounds, said Pip, a dreamy look coming over his face. All that money would be ours. We could spend it on anything we liked, said Beth. We could even buy that house in Spain Dad's always on about. Oh, a new caravan down here, with a bit more room in it, said Beth. Pip smiled as he thought of the 2 tiny bedrooms that he and Beth used. Or I could get a surfboard to use in Spain, he said. Pip looked at the other eager faces surrounding him, and suddenly he went very quiet. All the excitement drained out of him to be replaced with a tremendous sense of peace. He reached out and touched the weathered book, and he just knew that there was no way that he wanted this precious book to end up somewhere at the other end of the world. Pip was suddenly reminded of the story Nana had chosen to read to them last night. Beth, he said, do you remember what Nana read last night? She said that there could be no better story for us after finding the Psalter than the one about the young king called Josiah. He looked at the others round the table. Josiah had found the long-lost book of the law, Pip continued, hidden in the temple in Jerusalem. Although he was only a teenager, he had known how important the book was, and he decided to do the right thing and share it with the whole nation. He had realised that he might not be popular, but he knew that God would be pleased with him if he made the right choice. Pip stopped abruptly. Beth realised that he, too, wanted to make the right choice. She reached over and squeezed his hand. He took a deep breath, guessing correctly that she felt the same. Well, he began, we might not get thousands of pounds for it, but I think it should stay here. I mean, I'm not sure where, but... There was a moment's silence in the room, but lots of nods and smiles. Wow, said Mac, finally, looking keenly over at both children. Beth gave a tiny nod of her head. I think that's amazing, he said. All this time you've been searching for treasure, and now you've found some. You're not going to keep it. Well done, the both of you. Well done indeed, said Gramps. And I suppose that the museum would be best place for it, he asked, looking over at the Professor. That would be marvellous, absolutely marvellous, the Professor responded enthusiastically. That seems to be the best idea, said Greg, delighted that he had thought to invite Professor Jackson along to the meeting. When eventually they made their way back to the caravan, Pip and Beth were feeling extremely happy. They had had a fabulous lunch with Greg and Catherine. The Professor had told them how he would make a new exhibit in the library to commemorate the finding of the Psalter. The display would house the Psalter, the diary and the box, and a full explanation of how the mystery of the manor, as he called it, had been solved. He would call round the next day to get photographs of the children, the bridge, the house, and all the other key places mentioned in the diary. And so, the finale. A few hectic days later, as they were walking back from the den, they recognised Dad's car parked outside the caravan. They raced inside just as Nana was filling the kettle. Look who's just arrived, said Gramps. So, have you two been behaving yourselves? Asked Dad, giving them both a big hug. And have you had a good time? Asked Mum. Both children said, OK, with a secret smile to each other. Just OK, said Gramps. Well, a bit more than OK, beamed Beth. But we need to stop at W.H. Smith's on the way home, laughed Pip, because the museum gave us a £100 book voucher each to spend. I think you'd better be telling us all about it, said Dad. And they did. Pip finished by smiling and saying, "Someone really wants me to be reading this holiday. I guess I've learnt that books aren't so boring after all." And he and Beth had both decided that the first book they would buy for themselves would be a Bible. There's a little historical note here that just reminds us that although this is a work of fiction, the house and caravan site do exist. Creeksea Place is a 16th century Tudor house near Burnham-on-Crouch. Robert Hunter and his brother William were real people. William was martyred for his faith at Burntwood in Essex in 1555, handing his precious psalter to Robert. You can read about that in Fox's Book of Essex Martyrs. But there is, of course, no known connection between Robert Hunter and Creeksea Place. And maybe if you've enjoyed this Pip and Beth adventure, maybe you'd like to have a go at reading Book 2, which is called The Mystery of the Museum, when Pip and Beth go to America to try and solve another mystery. Hope you've enjoyed.